Hey, this is Russell Moore, and this is One Thing You Missed. I'm here tonight in my library, and I collect, as some of you know, bobbleheads. And one of my favorites is my favorite American founder, James Madison. And one of the interesting ththings about this is you notice if you were to pretend like you're asking a bobblehead a question, the response looks like not a nodding yes or a shaking no, but like a combination of the two. And I kind of think sometimes that's really appropriate because a lot of the conversations and debates that we have are about that kind of ambiguity. Are the founders nodding yes, or are the founders saying no? But there are some things that are completely clear. And one of those things is something I think we might have missed in some of the conversation this past week. I'm really reluctant to even bring this up because it was a statement made by a presidential candidate who's at 1% in the polls, 0.5% in some of the polls. And also, it's a statement that was roundly denounced by his fellow candidates. So it's not something that really is gaining much traction. But several people have asked me about Beto O'Rourke's comments about removing tax exemption from churches, synagogues, mosques, educational institutions, others that hold to a traditional, historic, biblical, not just biblical, but really in every just about major world religion, view of marriage and sexuality. And so the reason I think that is actually an important conversation is not because I think that this is somehow gaining ground, but because it's important to step back and to ask, why do we have tax exemption for religious institutions, for churches and other houses of worship and other religious organizations? And I think the assumption that Congressman O'Rourke made when he said we don't need any government benefit going to organizations that are outside of public policy on this point is precisely the problem. And sometimes I think even people who disagree with Congressman O'Rourke argue on those terms, whether you should have a government benefit or not have a government benefit. So, for instance, I will sometimes see Christians and others say we need tax exemption for these religious organizations because of all the good that they do. And that is, there is a huge case to be made for all of the good that is done in serving the poor, in dealing with disaster relief in ways that the government just couldn't come in and fill. But that's not why we have tax exemption. Tax exemption is not a government benefit at all. Tax exemption is a recognition that, as was mentioned by Daniel Webster and Chief Justice Marshall and others very early on in American jurisprudence, the power to tax is the power to destroy. A government that has taxation power over churches and synagogues and other religious organizations is a government that can destroy them. Now, the reason that's important in an American context is because that's what the debate was about when we came to issues of the First Amendment. Whether or not the government, like many governments around the world, could take taxes from people in order to build and to prop up a church, or whether the government could use taxation or other levers of power in order to suppress a church's teaching or a church's theology or church's practice or anything else. And in our system, we have determined the government ought to recognize that it should not intrude into the free exercise of religion. Taxation represents that there are places that the government does not stand as sovereign over those places and those ecosystems of thought and belief. That's why we have tax exemption. And so this isn't a government benefit. When the government does not tax a church or a religious organization, it is not out of charity from the government. It is because of a recognition of something that is really significant and important. That ought to be clear, no matter where we stand on all of these issues, as we seek to debate one another and seek to persuade one another, not to try to squelch dissent through the power of the government purse. So, we may have situations that come up where We look to the past and there seems to be a bobbing yes or no at the same time. But our convictions ought to be steady because we're the people who follow the Lord Jesus Christ, who, as the Apostle Paul tells us, in him is not yes and no, but the promises of God in him are always yes. That's good news. This is Russell Moore, and this is One Thing You Missed.